Daily Dose Biographies presents The American Presidents. Teddy Roosevelt. Born a sickly child in 1858 New York City, as a teenager, Teddy Roosevelt took up weightlifting and gymnastics, which transformed him into a strapping young man. Graduating Harvard College in 1880, Roosevelt studied law at Columbia University before his election to the New York State Assembly at age 23, losing both his wife and his mother on the same day in 1884, escaping overwhelming grief by spending the next 2 years at his ranch in the Badlands of the Dakota Territory. Upon his return to New York, Roosevelt married his childhood sweetheart, Edith Kermit Carroll, raising 6 children over the coming years. Following an unsuccessful 1886 run for mayor of New York, President Grover Cleveland awarded Roosevelt a job at the U.S. Civil Service Commission, followed by President William McKinley's choice as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, where Roosevelt's participation with the Rough Riders made him a standout war hero following the end of the Spanish-American War, an image which won him the governor's office for the state of New York. In 1900, after campaigning as William McKinley's running mate, covering 24 states and some 21,000 miles by train, McKinley won the White House after a landslide victory over Democrats William Jennings Bryan and Adlai Stevenson. Following McKinley's assassination on September 6, 1901, 42-year-old Teddy Roosevelt transformed the public image of the presidency with his youth and vigor, becoming the first president of the Progressive era, where he unfurled his square deal domestic program, promising to mediate between the conflicting interests of capital and labor, of isolationism and expansionism, of land conservation and development, all with the intent of stabilizing American society. Roosevelt's 2 terms in office witnessed the successful breakup of a railroad monopoly under the Sherman Antitrust Act, while mediating an equitable settlement of a coal miner strike in Pennsylvania. He also set aside some 200 million acres as protected national forests, while preserving 86 million acres of ancestral Native American lands. From a foreign policy standpoint, Roosevelt coined the motto, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," which he applied liberally in his dealings in Latin America, including the successful secession of Panama from Colombia, which paved the way for the construction of the Panama Canal. He also successfully meddled in affairs outside the Western Hemisphere, winning the Nobel Peace Prize for his negotiations to end the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, which included Japan's acceptance of an ongoing U.S. military presence in the Philippines. Avowing not to run for a 3rd term as president, Roosevelt formed the Progressive or Bull Moose Party in 1912 after President William Howard Taft failed to live up to his promises for progressive reforms. Shot in the chest by a fanatic would-be assassin while campaigning for president in Milwaukee, Roosevelt quickly recovered, at the same time losing his 3rd bid for the White House to Woodrow Wilson due to Roosevelt's division of Republicans during a 3-party election cycle. He passed away on January 6, 1919, after suffering a pulmonary embolism in his sleep, making Teddy Roosevelt one of the most dynamic leaders in American history. Teddy Roosevelt and the River of Doubt. 4 years after America's 26th president left office, a man averse to idle vacations, Teddy Roosevelt and his son Kermit embarked on a perilous journey down the Amazon's uncharted Rio da Duvida, or River of Doubt, an adventure that nearly cost the 55-year-old ex-president his life. Whether herding cattle on his ranch in the Dakotas, or hunting cougar in Arizona, even spending a year on safari in Africa, all of Roosevelt's pursuits came with high levels of hardship and risk, 2 components which he once famously termed as the strenuous life. Calling the trip his last chance to be a boy, the 2 Roosevelts set out with veteran Brazilian explorer Colonel Candido Rondon And when the head of the American Museum of Natural History attempted to warn Roosevelt of the dangers that lay ahead, Roosevelt replied, "If it is necessary for me to leave my bones in South America, I am quite ready to do so." After completing a lecture tour of South America, in late 1913, Roosevelt and Rondon set out with a small army of porters, scientists, and explorers, traveling by steamship to the remote Brazilian town of Tapirapoan, before embarking on a 2-month overland journey to the River of Doubt. Reaching the river in February of 1914, 22 intrepid explorers began their treacherous descent of the uncharted river, despite constant attacks by snakes, alligators, piranhas, hostile indigenous people, mosquitoes, and stinging flies. Slowed by repeated waterfalls on the river, the team of explorers were forced to either run the rapids or portage their dugout canoes overland. But when Roosevelt's 23-year-old son decided to run one particularly dangerous rapids on March 15th, Kermit's canoe was sucked into a hydraulic before plunging over a waterfall, taking the life of a Brazilian named Simplicio. Stalked by hostile natives and plagued by malaria, dysentery, and a troubling lack of supplies, Roosevelt fell ill to malaria before slicing his leg open on a rock. Reaching a low point in early April, after a porter named Julio shot and killed another man who had caught him stealing food. When the team failed to capture the murderer, they simply abandoned him to certain death in the jungle. Their clothes reduced to rags, Roosevelt weakened badly as the party survived on fish and hearts of palm. Losing a fourth of his body weight and now delirious with fever and infection, Roosevelt repeatedly implored the team to leave him behind to die. But Kermit would have no part of that, rowing his father to civilization on April 26, 1914, after a 2-month journey that left every man thankful to be alive, making Teddy Roosevelt's trip down the River of Doubt a life-altering adventure for the record books. Woodrow Wilson. Born in 1856 Virginia, Woodrow Wilson graduated Princeton in 1879 before attending UVA Law School, followed by a PhD from Johns Hopkins, before teaching jurisprudence and politics at Bryn Mawr, Wesleyan, and Princeton, becoming the 13th president of Princeton University from 1902 to 1910. During his time as an educator, he also published the 5-volume History of the American People, which romanticized both the Confederacy and the Ku Klux Klan, before winning the New Jersey governor's office in 1910, where he captured national attention as a progressive reformer. At age 56, Wilson won the White House in 1912 in a landslide election over a divided Republican Party, becoming the last American president to arrive at his inauguration in a horse-drawn carriage. During his first term in office, Wilson's progressive reforms included the Underwood-Simmons Act, which reduced tariffs on imports while imposing a new federal income tax. He also established the Federal Reserve to provide oversight over the nation's banking system and money supply, as well as the establishment of the Federal Trade Commission for the policing of unfair business practices. He also led the push for child labor laws, while establishing an 8-hour workday for railroad employees and a system of government loans for farmers. On the downside, however, he reversed hard-fought gains for African Americans by resegregating a number of federal agencies, effectively undoing important gains in racial equality since post-Civil War Reconstruction. Winning a second term by a narrow electoral margin, Wilson's campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," ended in early 1917, when Germany began the systematic sinking of U.S. merchant ships. When U.S. officials learned about the Zimmermann telegram, which exposed Germany's plot to draw Mexico into World War I on the side of Germany, in exchange for land ceded to the U.S. after the Mexican-American War. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, a decision which ultimately hastened the end of the First World War. In a January 1918 speech to Congress, Wilson outlined his 14 points to prevent future world wars, proposing a League of Nations to arbitrate international disputes between nations. A year later, he helped to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles at the Paris Peace Conference, which placed untenable reparations on Germany and ultimately led to the Second World War. His second term also saw the ratification of the Volstead Act, which brought prohibition to America on January 17, 1920, as well as passage of the 19th Amendment that same year, which gave women the right to vote. Leaving office in March of 1921, he passed away at his Washington, D.C. home on February 3, 1924, making the life and public policies of Woodrow Wilson a productive yet complex figure in 20th century history. Woodrow Wilson's racist policies. While Woodrow Wilson was lauded by most Americans for his leadership during the First World War, as well as his progressive reforms for American business and labor, his upbringing in antebellum Virginia tainted his views on race and segregation, which followed him all the way to the White House. For instance, in his 5-volume history series, A History of the American People, his written views on the institution of slavery adheres to what historians have called a lost cause narrative of the antebellum South, insisting that slavery was a gentle patrician affair, while recasting the Civil War as an issue of states' rights instead of slavery. His recorded views on post-Civil War Reconstruction further illuminate his racist bent, insisting that Reconstruction placed Southern white men under the intolerable burden of governments sustained by the votes of ignorant Negroes, while casting the Ku Klux Klan as an invisible empire of the South, bound together in loose organization to protect the Southern country from some of the ugliest hazards of a time of revolution. When Wilson entered the White House in 1913, he allowed the Southern members of his cabinet to segregate the Treasury, the Post Office, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, the Navy, the Interior, the Marine Hospital, the War Department, and the Government Printing Office, forcing the creation of separate offices, lunchrooms, and bathrooms for black federal employees, at the same time crushing whatever gains African Americans had made since the end of the Civil War. In a surviving transcript regarding an Oval Office meeting with civil rights activists Webb Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter, whom Wilson angrily threw out of his office in 1914, Wilson argued that segregation is not humiliating, but a benefit, and ought to be so regarded by you gentlemen. Since Wilson's racist views have surfaced, institutions and politicians have grappled with his legacy, prompting Monmouth University officials in June of 2020 to announce their intentions to rename Woodrow Wilson Hall, while after years of protests, Princeton University plans to remove Wilson's name from its prestigious public policy school, announcing that his segregationist sympathies and policies made Wilson an especially inappropriate namesake, making the racist policies of Woodrow Wilson a backsliding disappointment for racial equality in early 20th century America. Wilsonianism. As the horrors of World War I approached its final months of bloody conflict, taking the lives of some 40 million people, on January 8, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson outlined his now famous 14 points as a basis for ending the war while promoting world peace for future generations. Woven into his 14 points was a call for democracy instead of authoritarian rule, the later, Wilson believed, contributing greatly to the outbreak of the First World War. He also called for conflict resolution bodies such as the League of Nations and the United Nations, as well as an emphasis on the spread of capitalism and self-determination among nation-states. Wilson also called for collective security by means of a new sense of liberal internationalism instead of isolationism, including freedom of the seas, open borders, and an end to secret treaties between nations. In his own words, Wilson advocated for the General Association of Nations for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike, and in a later speech to Congress, that national aspirations must be respected while allowing people around the world to be governed by their own consent. Wilson's 14 points launched an intense wave of optimism within colonial-ruled nations in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, elevating Wilson to an almost godlike figurehead in colonial-ruled states around the world, prompting Indian nationalist Ganesh Shankar Vidyarthi to hail Wilson as the modern apostle of freedom. Optimism within colonial-ruled nations proved short-lived, however, when the June 28, 1919 signing of the Treaty of Versailles failed to end colonial rule of First World countries over Third World nations, descending citizens of marginalized countries into a communal state of disillusionment and continued despair. Some historians have suggested that not only did the punitive demands the treaty placed on Germany lead directly to the Second World War, but the treaty's complete rejection of Wilsonianism, as Wilson's 14 points are known today, led to a number of protest movements in colonial-ruled nations, including the Egyptian Revolution of 1919, Mahatma Gandhi's passive resistance movement in India, the March 1st movement in Korea, and China's 1919 May 4th movement, making Woodrow Wilson's 14 points a telling missed opportunity for world peace. Woodrow Wilson hallucinates at the Paris Peace Conference. During the Spanish pandemic of 1918, like other presidents before and since his administration, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson attempted to downplay the disease as the deadly pathogen spread to every corner of the globe. Citing key evidence from Wilson's papers, presidential historian Teddy Roosevelt called Wilson the worst U.S. president in terms of handling a disaster. Troy writes in his book entitled Shall We Wake the President? 2 Centuries of Disaster Management from the Oval Office. The federal response to the influenza outbreak in 1918 can best be described as neglectful. Hundreds of thousands of Americans died without President Wilson saying anything or mobilizing non-military components of the U.S. government to help the civilian population. In April of 1919, while sailing to the Big Four peace talks in Paris, Wilson and many of his staff contracted Spanish flu, including Wilson's daughter Margaret, several members of his Secret Service detachment, Wilson's stenographer, and his chief usher. While the Big Four were trying to resolve questions concerning German reparations, the creation of the League of Nations, and the threat of Bolshevism, Wilson's hallucinatory response to the flu and its associated high fever severely jeopardized the outcome of the talks. As the president's illness worsened, key aides became alarmed when the normally predictable Wilson began to blurt out unexpected orders. On one occasion, the president created a scene over pieces of furniture that had suddenly disappeared in his suite room, even though nothing about the furnishings had been moved. The president further became convinced that he was surrounded by French spies. We could but surmise that something queer was happening in his mind, Chief Usher Irwin Hoover later recalled. One thing was certain, Hoover goes on, Wilson was never the same after his little spell of sickness. Wilson's shift in mentation would forever impact the outcome of the Paris Peace Conference and ultimately the Treaty of Versailles. For while Wilson's initial stance was that the winners of World War I should go easy on Germany to facilitate a lasting peace, after coming down with influenza, Wilson conceded to the other world leaders' demands, setting the stage for a settlement so harsh and onerous to Germans that it became the leading rallying call for a revitalized German nationalism, the rise of Adolf Hitler, and the advent of World War II. Woodrow Wilson's White House sheep. After the United States entered the First World War in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson appealed to average Americans to make personal sacrifices in support of the war effort, using his bully pulpit to stoke Americans' sense of patriotism and compassion for soldiers abroad through food rationing and other personal sacrifices. In an attempt to lead by example, the President and First Lady Edith Wilson sacrificed with wheatless Mondays and meatless Tuesdays, riding in their horse-drawn carriage instead of an automobile to conserve fuel for the war effort, setting a further example by encouraging American women to care for American fighting men overseas. The First Lady sewed clothes for doughboys at a feverish pace. To further drive down taxpayer expense for maintaining the expansive lawns that surrounded the White House, in 1918, Dr. Cary Grayson, a close friend and personal aide to the President, purchased 12 sheep and 4 lambs from William Woodward's farm in nearby Bowie, Maryland, a flock that not only trimmed the White House lawns, but also produced over 90 pounds of wool that was auctioned off for the Red Cross War Fund, raising more than $50,000, or slightly more than $1 million in today's currency. Over the next 3 summers, the White House flock grew to 48 sheep, until glaring problems arose due to an overabundance of destructive, gluttonous sheep. According to a Washington Post article, the White House sheep grew increasingly spooked by the steady parade of cars that ferried tourists past the White House for a glimpse at the president's sheep, at the same time falling ill with pneumonia at the height of the Spanish flu pandemic, which infected more than 1/3 of the world's population, while taking the lives of an estimated 50 million people. They also tore up much of the back lawn of the White House, prompting Wilson to move them to the front lawn after erecting fences to protect the flowers and trees, which the sheep managed to destroy anyway. Sold off in 1920, the legacy of Wilson's sheep lives on in his presidential library in Staunton, Virginia, making Woodrow Wilson the one and only American president to show his patriotism through sheep. Warren G. Harding. Born in 1865 Corsica, Ohio, Warren G. Harding graduated from the now-defunct Ohio Central College in 1882, before moving to Marion and landing a job as a reporter. 3 years after marrying Florence Kling DeWolf in 1881, Harding and several business partners purchased the struggling Marion Star newspaper, turning it into a thriving success with the help of his wife's business acumen and marketing skills. Winning an Ohio Senate seat in 1898 for the next 5 years. In 1904, Harding became Ohio's lieutenant governor for a 2-year stint, before losing his own gubernatorial bid in 1910. Gaining national attention following his nomination speech at the Republican National Convention for President William Taft's second term, Harding was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1914, holding his seat until his election to the White House in 1921, alongside Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge as his running mate, winning 60% of the popular vote and a landslide electoral margin. Advocating for a return to normalcy following a nation's bloody involvement in the First World War, Harding followed a pro-business conservative Republican agenda, reducing taxes on corporations and wealthy Americans, while severely limiting immigration and imposing heavy import tariffs on goods competing with American industries. He also signed the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, which streamlined the federal budget system while establishing the General Accounting Office to audit federal expenditures, at the same time hosting a post-war naval disarmament summit for the world's leading powers of the day. while Harding's cabinet appointments of Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover and Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes were viewed as outstanding choices. Other cabinet members became embroiled in scandals and other misconduct, and while Harding was never accused of misconduct beyond alleged extramarital affairs and alcohol consumption in the White House, after his sudden death from a possible heart attack in 1923, his posthumous image was tarnished by such corrupt acts as the Teapot Dome scandal, when Interior Secretary Albert Fall rented public lands to oil companies in exchange for lavish gifts and personal loans. After his death in a San Francisco hotel, Harding's body was returned to Washington, D.C. on a funeral train, which drew massive crowds of mourners trackside as the train moved east for Harding's well-attended funeral, making the life and politics of Warren G. Harding a tragic end for America's 29th president.